Okay, sorry for the less than ideal transition. I had to kind of leave for the DC trip meeting. But anyway, we were talking about the election of 1912 and how you have four candidates. Theodore Roosevelt, the Bull Moose Party candidate, which is the most awesome rock and roll sounding party ever. You have the new face of the Democratic Party, Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow is a first name that I think sincerely needs to make a comeback. You have Eugene V. Debs, the Socialist Party. This is actually where the Socialist Party and a socialist candidate become newsworthy for the first time in American history. And then you have, almost as an afterthought, the actual incumbent president of the United States himself, William Howard Taft. And remember, William Howard Taft is Theodore Roosevelt's sidekick. But eventually, what happens is that Roosevelt gets frustrated with Taft's policies. Or debatably, he gets frustrated with the fact that Taft is in charge and not him. From Taft's perspective, one of the things I didn't tell you guys is that Taft never wanted to be president, and really, he actually considered dropping out of the race altogether, which is pretty incredible considering the guy is the incumbent and he won the Republican Party's nomination. Despite this fact, he kind of runs because when Roosevelt comes after him, he feels like he kind of has to dig in his heels and fight back. But at one part of the campaign, sort of towards the end, when it looks like Taft is not going to be reelected, he breaks down in tears. And his aides come up to him and they're like, yeah, we're sorry, Mr. President. We're sorry that the numbers aren't looking good. Your chances are kind of diminishing. And Taft replies, no, I'm not crying because of that. I'm crying because I lost my best friend. His best friend being Theodore Roosevelt. So there's almost this Shakespearean tragedy involved. And by the way, you guys should think about that next time you refer to Taft as the president who gets stuck in the bathtub. Shame on you for finding humor in that, even though, yeah, it is kind of funny. Anyway, so I should also mention that, remember, Theodore Roosevelt is running on a third-party platform. And you could kind of criticize Roosevelt potentially as being an egomaniac, which he kind of is to a certain extent, that he's just running because he wants to be the guy that's in charge, which is true. But at the end of it all, Roosevelt isn't just running and saying, hey, you should vote for me because I really want to be president. Like, he puts forward a really interesting policy platform that is much more progressive than his platform in 1904, the platform of new nationalism. So you have a new platform that's kind of compelling. You know, people can disagree with it, but there's something to it. You can't accuse Roosevelt of, let's say, not campaigning on the issues. And in fact, this is where I would love to tell you that, well, things are looking up for Roosevelt, but he makes a few critical mistakes. But in actuality, he has a great platform, and he campaigns much more energetically than he does even in 1904. And think about this. When Roosevelt is giving a speech extolling the virtues of new nationalism in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, he gets shot. Apparently, the bullet is lodged just a few inches away from his heart, and the impact of the bullet is actually deadened by the sheer thickness of his rather voluminous speech in his jacket pocket. But anyway, at this point, his aides are like, maybe we should kind of reschedule this speech because, you're shot, sir. And Roosevelt gets up there and stands in front of the crowd and says, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid that I'm going to have to keep my remarks brief because BT Dubs, I've just been shot. And then he proceeds to talk for an hour and a half. I mean, just imagine the mental image of this. Like, the guy is talking about welfare, public health care. He's talking about America's role in the world. And I just imagine him wearing this pristine white shirt and just seeing the red start to spread everywhere. And he's just kind of going with it. Like, he gets shot. and still gives his political speech, and he still loses the race. And if you can have a great, compelling platform, and if you campaign so tirelessly that even getting shot doesn't stop you, then if that's the case, what third party could ever hope to win the presidency? In fact, this is kind of maybe the best chance for any third party candidate to win the White House. And admittedly, Theodore Roosevelt is pretty exceptional because the guy was already president beforehand. Anyway, you have Woodrow Wilson, who, as we talked about beforehand, has this platform called New Freedom. New Freedom is kind of, in some respects, it builds off of older populist platforms like the Ocala platform or the Omaha platform. You see this drive to reform tariffs. You see this drive to curtail and reform businesses. Also, Wilson pledges to create some type of financial assistance for farmers, and he believes in central banking reform to give farmers the financial relief. Because remember, we're still in this economy in which the dollar is deflating. Deflation is something that, if you recall, hurts the spending power, the buying power of farmers. So in some respects, it's kind of like a watered down version of these earlier, more radical platforms. And that goes to the fact that, remember, when William Jennings Bryan runs for the White House in 1896, the Populist Party consumes the Democratic Party from the inside. Or you could make the case that maybe it's the other way around. But in either case, if you think of the Democratic Party as like Voltron or Megazord from the Power Rangers, it's now formed from all of these separate robotic organisms that now form this super party of Southerners, of Midwestern farmers, and in Wilson's case, some urban intellectuals in the big city. Now, there's also one other thing that I should mention about Wilson specifically. It's going to seem tangential for right now, but it becomes a major plot point in maybe about a week. Wilson was told at a very early age that he would need to retire from public life because apparently Wilson is such a tryhard that he works himself into a fit. I suppose, being an academic, he was in this sort of environment where it's publish or perish, and apparently that's kind of a consistent thing for academics across history. And Wilson works so hard that apparently he has this debilitating stroke. And his doctors tell him that if he works any further, he's going to have an even more massive stroke that he won't recover from. Well, we talked about the fact that medical technology was pretty primitive, but also that's kind of a two-way street. Maybe part of the reason that medicine wasn't as effective in the early 20th century, late 19th century, is because people really didn't listen to their doctors. And Wilson, being the educated progressive that he was, decides to promptly ignore his doctor's advice, unless you consider running for the presidency a cakewalk, which it most certainly is not. So Wilson ignores his doctor's advice and decides to work a little bit further. That can't end catastrophically, can it? So anyway, we'll come back to this plot point a little bit later, but first, let's resolve the election of 1912. So what happens is that the Republican Party is split down the middle. If you look at the Electoral College results, the Democratic Party gets 82% of the outstanding electoral votes. Because remember, Electoral College votes are given to the party that wins the majority of votes in a particular state. But if you look at the popular vote returns, you get a very different picture. The Socialist Party wins about 6%, which compared to, let's say, where the socialists are starting from, isn't that bad. And actually, in some Midwestern states like Indiana, socialists managed to elect a lot of mayors and local political positions. So Debs doesn't win, but that's kind of a foregone conclusion. The socialists actually do pretty well. What happens, though, is that there's a split within the Republican Party voter base. Some Republicans vote for Roosevelt, some vote for Taft. But what actually happens is that President Roosevelt gets more popular votes than William Howard Taft, and the result is that the vote is split at the state level, and Wilson manages to actually win the vast majority of the Electoral College votes. If you look, poor William Howard Taft only wins Vermont and Utah. Awkward. Roosevelt does a bit better, winning California, Pennsylvania, Washington, and a few other larger states. But again, it's not enough, despite his sort of the amazing feat of running as a third party. It's not enough to actually win the election. So Roosevelt is defeated, but to be honest, he's kind of okay with that, because Roosevelt arguably isn't running for the presidency because it's the next stepping stone in his political career. He's done that. He's got the t-shirt. He's retired. He's just doing it because he can, because he's now kind of an old fogey that's bored. Like, what else was he going to do? Sit on his front porch like William McKinley in the election of 1896? I mean, there's really nothing left to look forward to, so why not? You know? And actually, he believes that Woodrow Wilson is a pretty good candidate, which is kind of awkward. You know, usually presidential candidates we associate as, as being really hostile to one another. He believes that Wilson has a progressive agenda that's similar to his own. And he believes that the nation will be in good hands. And so he wishes Wilson well. Yes, we do. He wishes Wilson well, and Wilson sort of goes off into the sunset. It's only when war breaks out in Europe that Roosevelt gets super upset. Because at that point, Roosevelt has been waiting his entire life for an event just like that. If there's one president who knew how to fight a war and potentially win a war, it's Roosevelt. The guy wrote a book at Harvard about naval war in the War of 1812. Like, he studied war religiously. He was waiting for an event exactly like this, and he missed it by 2 years. So let's look a little bit at Woodrow Wilson's policies, because Woodrow Wilson, spoiler, becomes associated as the president who gets the United States involved with World War I, which, by the way, is true, but that's kind of an accident of history. Wilson is somebody who has no clear foreign policy views. In fact, if anything, Wilson is something of a pacifist. And by the way, always be afraid of Americans who have no clear foreign policy views and are pacifists, because they're going to get you into a war. That's just kind of a fluke of American history. The presidents that are really bellicose, who have very extreme foreign policies, who like war, for whatever reason, they tend to be a little more understanding about the use and utility of power. By the way, we'll cover that a little bit more when we get to Woodrow Wilson, or rather the lead up to World War I specifically. But Wilson is elected president with a domestic mandate. And remember, even though he gets about 43% of the popular vote, every presidential candidate proposes some degree of progressive reform. The only question is, how progressive should it be? All of them, if you remember, champion the idea of women's suffrage. All of them believe that the government needs some larger role to a certain extent. Again, the question is the degree. So Wilson, when he's elected, under his direction, Congress passes an addendum to the Sherman Antitrust Act, the Clayton Antitrust Act. Remember that the Sherman Antitrust Act is very rarely used, and when it's used at all, it's used just as frequently against labor unions as against corporations. The Clayton Antitrust Act provides an exemption for labor unions. And Samuel Gompers of the American Federation of Labor says that the Clayton Antitrust Act is the Magna Carta of labor. Little extreme, but again, it's probably pretty sound. It does provide labor unions with the ability to operate without having to worry about going into battle against both corporations and the federal government.